Ladies and gentlemen, I want to thank SPUC for the privilege of speaking to you today, because SPUC is in Europe unrivaled in its total defense, its absolute defense of life and love, of life within the context of marriage. This is very important. What I'm going to say is rather serious, because the thing is rather serious. I'm a doctor. Medicine is rather serious. But lest you worry, I want you always to have hope. Because here is hope. Here are 4 of my grandchildren, our grandchildren, under the age of 1. How many people can have 4 grandchildren sitting in their knees under the age of 1? Rochelle, Francesca, Ralph, Rosanna Maria, all under the age of 1. There is great room for hope, but you ain't got the alternative. There is no choice between good and evil. Throughout the world, 2 paradigms are complete blueprints for families at a total war. The civilization of love and the culture of death. And in this year of the canonization of Blessed John Paul the Great, I wish to propose to you your life's work. Your young people. Your life's work is revolution. You must revolt. A revolution in which you replace today's culture of death, which has been constructed by aggressive, atheistic, wealthy Western elites, with a new civilization of love, based upon God, based upon marriage, your future marriages, and based upon your future families. It is not impossible that all the laws protecting the family, protecting human sexuality and the unborn, will be removed in Western Europe and elsewhere. The only protectors of your family, then, from a coercive state, will be you, the parents, the primary educators of your children. There are many families in the US, France, Russia, Spain, Latvia, all over, who are of the same mind. They do see the crisis, and you must make common cause with them. You will not be alone. Firstly, you must understand why parental rights are so central. And secondly, you must understand how they have been removed. Our enemies know that parental rights are central. We don't. Why is the primary educator, the parent, important? The truth that parents, not the state, are the primary educators of children has been known, has been evident to all free men throughout history. 360 years before Christ, Aristotle taught this. Not a Christian. But that moral education must take place primarily in the intimate community of the family, and that nothing must be allowed to undercut this primacy. In the 6th century before Christ, we were given the 4th commandment: honor thy father and thy mother. The truth about the primary educator was affirmed by our Lord in his teaching and in his life. He went down with them to Nazareth and lived in subjection to them. Blessed John Paul, my great hero, he taught. He was revolutionary. He really was. He taught that the parent is the primary educator because it is fundamentally rooted upon parental transmission of life and love for the child. Love, life. The Orthodox Church, and we have some Romanians here, I was very pleased to see them. I work a lot with the Russian Orthodox pro-life movement, which has been very courageous and quite successful. And the Orthodox Church teaching is that children, that the role of family in the formation of the personality is exceptional. No other social institution can replace it. Because natural law is the patrimony of parents, the body of law protecting their rights is overwhelming. Yes, they are trying to bring in all sorts of weird laws, but fundamentally the body of law is overwhelmingly on our side. The most important is the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, 1949, which starts, "Whereas disregard and contempt for human rights have resulted in barbarous acts which have outraged the conscience of mankind," and goes on, "the family is the natural and fundamental," uses this strange expression, "group unit of society, and is entitled to protection by society and by the state." In her book, A World Made New, Professor Mary Ann Glendon points out that a third aspect was built in, and that was that parents had a prior right to choose the kind of education that will be given to their children. And she points out that this was put in because Hitler had used the educational system to indoctrinate children. Now, I have sat in a consulting room for the best part of 40 years, and you might think that this is abstract. Talking of the United Nations, talking of all of these things is abstract. I assure you it is not. It filters down to ordinary people really very quickly, and it destroys their family. So the things that I'm going to talk about are technical, but by golly, they stop being technical when you've got a little woman sitting in front of you or a child sitting in front of you. It then becomes real. So that is why this right is important. I want to tell you about how it was removed. Where is that? Well, I'll just take you the link, right? First one. This chap. Karl Marx. The Communist Manifesto, written by Marx and Engels. I quote some points from it. Abolition of the family. The bourgeois family will vanish. But you will say, we destroy the most hallowed of relations when we replace home education by social. The bourgeois claptrap about the family and education, about the hallowed correlation of parent and child, becomes all the more disgusting. These are serious, competent people. This was a Western philosophy. Cruelly, it was exported to Russia. And of course, we had the October Revolution in 1917, and how the Russians suffered from this export from the West. This lady is Alexandra Kollontai. I wouldn't think anybody has ever heard of her here. Alexander Kollontai was the first Soviet People's Commissar for Social Welfare. She wrote, "Communist society will take upon itself all the duties involved in the education of the child." All the duties. Now you're going to hear this consistently through this paper. In 1922, Lenin called a meeting of Marxist intellectuals to study why the Bolshevik Revolution had not spread to the West. Lenin didn't much like Russia. It was a primitive place. His eye was in the west of Europe. But communism wouldn't spread. They had had an abortive attempt in Munich and in Budapest. It hadn't worked, and they had to work out why. So he called his intellectuals together to find out why. And according to the major conservative thinker Ralph de Toledano, this meeting was perhaps more harmful to Western civilization than the Bolshevik Revolution itself. Yes, next please. This group of people, I just want to mention two of the names. George Lukács, he believed that Judeo-Christian belief had to be erased by the use of sexual instinct, because one of their main conclusions was that they had failed in Western Europe because of a residual Christian culture. That communism wouldn't spread. So he thought, we've got to get rid of Judeo-Christianity by the use of sexual instinct, and he wrote a book called Revolution and Eros. Next. The next chap, Willy Munzenberg, said that intellectuals were to be organized to use the most negative, destructive criticism possible in every sphere of life to make Western civilization stink. Well, I can tell you that when I speak to Orthodox audiences, that Ukrainians come up to me, or Russians, and say, we didn't know people like you existed in England. That is the feeling that people have of our culture. Many, many places. This group, there were 20 or so in it. The family and its rights over education were to be eradicated, including in the area of sexual and homosexual indoctrination in schools. The traditional relationship between men and women, specifically the roles of fathers and mothers, especially the authority of fathers, were to be destroyed. Along came Stalin, and he considered these people revisionists, Lenin's friends, started killing them. So they hopped it. And they went to Germany, went to Frankfurt, worked together in Frankfurt, and that was how they got the name, and this is important, the Frankfurt School. Along came Hitler. He didn't like them either. And then they went to America and used American commercial, academic, and media resources to spread their silent world revolution. This silent revolution has never stopped in the West. Saul Alinsky, who died in 1972, was an American transitional Marxist who supported the Frankfurt School's long march through the institutions, particularly churches. Alinsky dedicated his book, entitled Rules for Radicals, to Lucifer, whom he called the first radical. His two best-known disciples are Barack Obama, I'm not saying Lucifer's disciples, Barack Obama and Hillary Clinton. Very much formed by this man. In 1948, the first director of the World Health Organization, Dr. Brock Chisholm, said this: children have to be freed from religious and other cultural prejudices forced upon them by parents and religious authorities. He went on to explain how. Sex education should be introduced in the 4th grade, eliminating the ways of the elders, if necessary by force. Please don't think this is academic stuff. In 1963, I'm telling you these things because I want you to understand that what has happened is not just been a sort of philosophical evolution, that there have been people doing this, and they are integrated. And we want to stop being naive. And I've come here today, in my 8th decade, to speak to you, young people, to say, don't let this happen to your children. Don't show the same neglect to your children that my generation did, and the generation before. You must waken up. Lady Helen Brooke started the first secret provision of contraceptives for the young in '63. This gradually became the locomotive of the sexual revolution. And it also became the locomotive of the removal of parents' rights from their children, the right to protect their children. So you can see how the earlier people I've been speaking about, this is all actually beginning to work. Lady Brooke later wrote, and this is really interesting, it is now the privilege of the parental state to take major decisions, objective, unemotional. The state weighs up what is best for the child. I want you to think back to this lady Alexandra Kollontai, who said, communist society will take upon itself all the duties involved in the education of the child. It's the same thing. And then, of course, we had the Abortion Act in 1967, about which I will not speak. Everyone here is much better qualified to speak about this than me. Next year I want to go to 74. And a very important thing happened in 1974, which is really not known, and will be known to the medical students here. Who has heard of Gillick competency? Right. In 74, a spokesman, I just say this to give you the flavour, a spokesman of the Family Planning Association said, parents, they are the most dangerous people of all. In 1974, a memorandum of guidance was produced by the British government, which prohibited people like me, doctors, from informing parents when children came for contraceptives. Children of whatever age, The memorandum was produced with advice from the Family Planning Association. I saw this, I was a young doctor, I saw this, and I thought it was odd. Just odd. A bit horrible, but I was young. I decided after a while to fight it. In 1984, a Catholic mother of 10, Mrs. Victoria Gillick, the name is known to the medical students, took the Department of Health to court to oppose the 1974 Memorandum of Guidance, which removed parents' rights. In the first court, Mrs. Gillick lost. In the second court of appeal, she won. And that held for 10 months. I'd like to ask you a question. In that 10 months, doctors were forbidden to give contraceptives to children without parental knowledge and consent. How many of you think the abortion figures went up in that cohort of people? How many think the abortion figures went up? 1. How many think the illegitimacy figures went up? Contraceptive uptake went down, abortion figures went down, and illegitimacy went down. And our enemies know this. The case then went to the House of Lords. Surprise, surprise, we lost. Oh, Vicky Gillick, incredibly courageous woman, a heroic figure, made huge sacrifices. Here, there's a sign that says IPPF. This pathetic black building is the geopolitical epicenter of the culture of death. IPPF designs laws all over the world for the removal, for killing, and the removal of parents' rights. IPPF has an income of and some of the experts here may correct me, may update me, had an income of 107 million. There are 149 member associations, and it works in 189 countries. It is the nerve center of our enemy. This is the center of common law jurisdiction. And you change a law here, and you can make off the peg abortion laws throughout for a third of the world, using common law jurisdiction. Their view of you as future parents, most of you will be future parents. Parents do not have rights over their children. IPPF defines young people as between 10 and 25 or 24. All young people, your future, must be able to choose from a full range of contraceptives. In 1994, parents' rights over abortion were removed by the courts. In 2004, the General Recommendations of the United Nations Committee on Elimination of Discrimination Against Women instructed state parties to ensure the right both to sexual education and contraception and abortion for girls and adolescents without parental knowledge. This is the level of the pressure that you are up against. This is not theoretical. Why would these multi-million-pound organisations be doing it if it didn't work? And I want to speak about churchmen. I better have a drink before I do that. Maybe you better. Clerical liberalism has been fundamental to the success of the culture of death. The crucial event was the Lambeth Conference in 1930, when for the first time in Christian history, a Christian body, the Church of England, morally sanctioned the use of contraceptives in marriage. Dr. Rowan Williams, the last head of the Church of England, has repeatedly taught that since non-procreative sex is acceptable in contraception, it must logically follow that homosexual acts are morally justifiable. I totally agree with you. Totally. I am convinced, after many years in this field, that the artificial separation of the unitive from the procreative aspects of human intercourse is fundamental to today's culture of death. Without it, there's no contraception and all of its ugly children. There is no in vitro fertilization and homosexual acts. All involve separation. It is the culture of death that underlies abortionism and euthanasia. It is the culture that we must replace. It is the culture you must replace for your own good. In 1930, in answer to the Lambeth Conference, Pope Pius XI, who also fought Nazism very vigorously, wrote an encyclical called Casti Connubii, which means chaste marriage. And he stressed the holiness of marriage and prohibited the use of contraception. It's very interesting at that point in history that he associated contraception with the eugenic movement. And look what just was going to happen a few years later in Germany. He also associated contraception with abortion. But he said a thing that you will very rarely hear from churchmen nowadays. The family is more sacred than the state, and that men are begotten not for the earth and for time, but for heaven, salvation. You don't hear that much. Humani Vitae was the great watershed encyclical of the last century. I only want to deal with one point of Humani Vitae. It's the encyclical dealing with contraception. Paul VI pointed out that if married couples considered contraception to be a legitimate solution to their difficulties, then one can understand. Then the state could feel justified in imposing it. And I'm telling you, this has been imposed through sex classes in schools for many, many years. Blessed John Paul the Great. One can't. He's just so astounding. It's impossible to overstate the grace of this pontificate. He gave us Familiaris Consortio, the role of the family in the modern world, the Charter of the Rights of the Family, and Evangelium Vitae. In this country we have some bishops who follow John Paul. We have Bishop Mark Davis, who said, "Today we see a government seeking to impose one of the greatest acts of social engineering in our history by uprooting the legal definition of marriage. Marriage lies at the very foundation of the family." It's very edifying to a bishop who is a bishop and teaches the teaching of Jesus Christ. Bishop Philip Egan, talking of homosexual marriage, "It is the inevitable outcome of a process that has been gathering pace since the sexual revolution of the 60s, but particularly artificial contraception, which splits the two ends of sexual intercourse, the unitive and the procreative. We really have split the atom. Everything becomes possible." But I have to say that English episcopal policies on contraception, abortion, parents' rights, sexual orientation, homosexual marriage, schools, the closure of our adoption agencies, have been deeply damaging to individual families. I have lived through half a century of neglectful, scandalous episcopal policies which have done untold damage to families. Not just Catholic families, but the witness has not been there for society at large. Hansard, a recent report in Hansard, I think is very important. The noble lord said, "I set up an expert group to look at compulsory sex and relationship education. Group centres young people, churches, Catholic education service. I had a very good conversation with Vincent Nichols, whom I warmly congratulate, and I warmly congratulated him on being made a cardinal." He goes on, speaking about all of these organisations. "We achieved consensus around the need for compulsory sex and relationship education." Compulsory sex, relationship education? You know what that is in the school. You know how filthy it is. Pope Benedict taught that one of the three principal non-negotiable focuses of the Church's intervention in the public arena is the protection of the inalienable right of parents to educate their children. If it is true, it may not be true. This may be a distortion in Hansard. If it is true that Bishop Cardinal Nichols has supported the consensus for compulsory sex education, he would be supporting the usurping of the rights of every parent in this country. It would be the ultimate episcopal betrayal of our families. I'm going to touch on individual countries. Using the work of Aidan Nichols QC on the issue of homosexual marriage, he says that if same-sex marriage is legalized, which it has been, parents who object to it being taught to their children in general classes in school, not sex education classes, will have no right to withdraw the child. The school will be obliged to refuse because of its legal obligation to promote equality. A parental challenge under the European Convention of Human Rights will have little prospect of success. On sex education itself, as opposed to general classes, he says that the Education Act 1996 imposes a duty on schools to teach about marriage, and this would apply to same-sex marriage as well. So I contend that homosexual equality laws, particularly where they involve marriage, are incompatible with the primary right of parents to educate their children, as specified in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And I think that's where you are, and I think that's what you're going to have to change. You can't make the mess of it that my generation has made, not for the sake of my grandchildren. I want to say a word of thanks to John Henry Weston, who is here, and for LifeSite. LifeSite brings a mirror to the world and shows us the mosaic of the mosaic of the paradigm that is happening in Canada, that is happening in Uganda, that is happening in Germany. It is all going to happen everywhere. I was advised this many years ago by one of the 3 permanent assistants in ecology in the United Nations. It's all going to happen. In Germany, in 2006, Conrad versus Germany, the European Court of Human Rights ruled that German Christians did not have the right to homeschool because they would set up parallel societies. And parents who objected and did homeschool went to jail for 43 days. Twice, I think. They go to jail. I'm talking of individual families. The Wunderlich family, in August 2013, a team of 20 social workers, armed police officers, special agents, they were even armed with a battering ram, seized 4 children from this family in Germany because they homeschooled. The judge even authorized force against the children. They homeschooled on grounds of conscience because they didn't want their children to be taught paganism, homosexuality and witchcraft. The authorities said they were well educated, not abused, well looked after. The family, yeah. And the judge said the request for the parents to reinstate the right to determine the location of their children where they were, the right to make educational decisions, and the right to file legal applications on their behalf, the right to try to escape legally, was refused, and the passports were removed. And the poor family gave in, sent the children to school. The Romke family, they fled to America, and the immigration judge gave them permission to stay on grounds of conscience and persecution. Obama's government has hounded them, and they have finally lost. at the Supreme Court. And I was told by their lawyer 3 days ago, that they will go back to Germany. The French turned out in the biggest demonstrations since the Second World War in defense of marriage and the family. This is what they got. These are people like you. These are not thugs. They're not fascists. People like you. The Cardinal Archbishop of Paris, with equal French logic, hit the nail on the head. He said the question is one of a future which is determined through the education of children. In Canada, you see the riot police and the old lady. Next one. Boy. Next. Parent opposed his daughter being taught foulness in schools, and this was a cartoon. He was defending his child. That is hate speech. Next, please. It is not hate speech to attack the cross and the Bible. And that is the same parent. Spain, the people rebelled. And now, homosexuality, Marxism, blasphemy, atheism will no longer be taught in the schools. In Scotland, where some of you come from, we see the Children and Young People's Bill, which is going to appoint monitors for every young person in Scotland. In California, we see that parents cannot get their child treated if the child seems to be experiencing same-sex attraction. The same is happening here now. Look, at the beginning, I called you to a revolution, but not like their revolution, to a revolution of love, a revolution for a new civilization of love, a revolution that depends upon your rights as parents. And come, 4 lines. Speaking of this revolution, Pope John Paul said, families should grow in awareness of being protagonists of what is known as family politics and assume responsibility for transforming society. Otherwise, and this is the big attraction, otherwise families will be the first victims of the evils they have done no more than note with indifference. My purpose in this talk to you as young people has been to do an autopsy of the evil, to lay it out for you, so that you don't fall for this madness. All my life, adult life, I've been inspired by one man, the great saint of life and love, a man that I met, and I think that I would like him to give you his message himself.
Di una rigenerazione della società umana, anzi della Chiesa come società degli uomini. Si deve cominciare da questo punto, da questa missione. Chiesa Santa di Dio, tu non puoi fare la tua missione, non puoi compiere la tua missione nel mondo se non attraverso la famiglia e la sua missione. Noi siamo immersi attraverso il sacramento dell'acqua e dello Spirito Santo, immersi in questo mistero pasquale di Cristo, la sua morte e sua resurrezione. Siamo immersi per ritrovare la pienezza della vita. E quella pienezza dobbiamo ritrovarla nella dimensione della persona, ma nello stesso tempo nella dimensione della famiglia, comunione delle persone, per portare, ispirare con questa novità di vita i diversi ambienti, le società, i popoli, le culture, la vita sociale, la vita economica, tutto questo per la famiglia. Sì, voi dovete andare dappertutto nel mondo per ripetere a tutti, per la famiglia, non a costo della famiglia, ripetere a tutti, per la famiglia, non a costo della famiglia.